Hey, this is Sanyam Bhutani, and you're listening to Chai Time Data Science, a podcast for data science enthusiasts where I interview practitioners, researchers, and Kagglers about their journey, experience, and talk all things about data science. Hello and welcome to Quarantine Content with Research Heroes, CTDS.Show. In this episode, I interview Dr. Dima Damen, who's an associate professor at the University of Bristol, and her research interests are primarily in action recognition and video recognition. As you might imagine, we talk about her journey into the field and her research. Honestly, I feel this interview, every single one of the answers by Dima, literally every single one of her quotes, I wish I could hang them near to my desk if I would do any research. This is one of the most amazing interviews that I have had the opportunity to conduct from a research perspective. So I'm really excited to be sharing this. We talk about Dima's journey, what she's learned from working with so many students, advising PhD, masters, and undergrad students, about how she teaches computer vision, the research she's done, including her recent works on action recognition, along with Kitchens 100 dataset that she's recently created along with her group. All of the research discussed in this interview is linked in the show notes, so please feel free to find that. I hope you find this interview as insightful as I have. This is definitely the best till date interview that I had the opportunity to conduct in terms of the advices for computer vision research or research broadly speaking. With that, I won't stand between you and the interview. Here's the conversation. Please enjoy the show. Hi everyone, today I get to interview another computer vision research hero, Dr. Dima Damen. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for the invite. Good to see you.
I learned a lot by reading your papers recently before the interview as well, and I watched a lot of your talks. I'm really excited to be talking to you.
Thanks a lot. It's a lot of effort from your end, so well done. Yeah.
It didn't feel like an effort, but I want to start by talking about your traditional path, if I may, into computer vision research. I believe you've done your PhD, if I may, in the pre-deep learning era when deep learning wasn't so famous.
Correct.
What led you to being interested in computer vision?
So during my master's, which was at the University of Leeds, I took a bunch of courses. One of them was computer vision, which I didn't take in my undergrad. So it was my first experience with the concept of computer vision. And I remember the assignment we had to do was you put your hand in front of the camera, you count how many fingers, right? We had to do it by mapping the silhouette and counting peaks and valleys. And it was like very, very old school then. But I thought that there must be something more in this field, right? I was a very good programmer. I enjoyed what was object-oriented because it was then, during my undergrad, was like the object-oriented thing. You're like very proud that we can then, plug and play components in software. So I felt comfortable with, let's say, software engineering. I felt very uncomfortable with computer vision. Like, what is this? You would walk down the street, let's say, and you would see the car at night and it's red. But if you take the pixels, there is no information in the pixels that give you that knowledge. It's somewhere else. So I would say I felt challenged by computer vision. That's where I did my master's project. And then it just rolls. I was offered the position to do a PhD in computer vision. And I really like it. I am still equally challenged now as when I started.
The challenge you took up initially during your PhD, I believe, was related to action recognition related to bicycles. Please correct me if I'm wrong. What has changed since then? You still find it challenging? You sort of still working in the same field of video and action recognition. Can you tell us more about that?
Correct. When I started my PhD, that is 2006, my first meeting with my supervisor, David Hogg, whom I learned a lot from, I wanted to do what is now known as re-ID, which is you see two individuals and you try to figure out whether they're the same. And he was very wise. He told me, yeah, it's a great problem. Maybe you would want to explore something less tackled. And he said he had received an email that the bicycle was stolen on campus. Maybe I would want to start playing with this idea of detecting bicycle thefts, and we see how it goes. And the problem ended up very, very complex because if you look at the CCTV footage, you really can't detect the theft itself. The only thing you can look at is whether whether the bicycle had been picked up by a person who definitely is not the same person as the person who dropped it, which could be hours or days before. So this kind of gave us this explosion of an optimization problem. How can we get the best global solution? And I was very lucky because I could even tell my grandparents that I was doing something that they could understand, right? I could say, I'm doing bicycle theft detection. And so from both ends, I was really lucky to get this problem that was very challenging, still underexplored, which is linking events that are very far in time, and an application that I could talk to anyone about during my PhD rather than I'm doing an obscure PhD topic. And then after finishing my PhD, I wanted to do more on video understanding. I thought images were like there, but there is a lot of effort put to come up with an image, right? The photography concept of framing and finding the right shot, let's say. If you don't have that effort, then you are in what I call computer vision, which is you have this continuous stream of information and you've taken this framing help, let's say. So I wanted to continue in video understanding. I moved to Bristol. And at Bristol, they were doing a lot of SLAM work. SLAM was very popular, so they had these handheld cameras, which they were kind of moving around and building representations of the scene. And moving from surveillance to the footage I was seeing in SLAM, I was like, oh, this is where we need to do video understanding and action, not in this very far, camera in the corner. So basically, I continued around the same path, just observing what the community was offering in terms of wearable cameras or handheld cameras. And that's what I still specialize in, trying to understand actions as subtle as all the way from theft to how well you perform an action, but now from a camera that's much closer to the action, which is a wearable camera.
What tools were you using during that time? CV2, you mentioned I think the theme at that time was more related to odometry and optical flow problems. I might be wrong.
There was a lot of separating background from foreground. There was a belief that we need to remove distractors to do anything useful, right? So there was this, which comes back now in the concept of attention, right? But at least at that time, it was very much what would you as a human remove from the scene to focus on what's relevant.
Gaussian blur everything, then feed it into the pipeline.
Do background subtraction, and then you would do a bit of tracking, and then so the concepts are very similar. I think we were very lucky to have started pre-deep learning because we were able to understand some of the foundations that are currently under the hood, and many students struggle because it's under the hood. We really know what optical flow is and what tracking is because we've done it with the programming aspect, like we were actually tracking. And we can read papers before deep learning and papers after deep learning. And I always have this concern that when I give an old paper to a student now, the terminology has changed so much that they can't build the maps. So it looks like we're reinventing lots of the wheels because we've changed the terminology so much unnecessarily. So there isn't a big difference between Bayesian networks and kind of whatever is a two-layer MLP, right? There are a few additions, but Bayesian networks have been there all the time. And I think it's a little bit, it's a concern that we've lost touch of the terminology. So I would say it was great to have done my PhD before deep learning. The community was smaller. No one knew what we would do with this thing. So no one was thinking about application or industry. And when I finished my PhD, there wasn't any job for someone who's a graduate of computer vision. There were a few in graphics, if you wanted to change field, but there isn't like a computer vision research or software engineer position anywhere. So maybe what you call my traditional path was at that time the only path, and I wouldn't change it. I think I like to keep hopping. Imagine a problem gets solved to me, you know, I'm no longer interested in it. I want to try something else. I think even though I've never tried industry, my style is more suitable to what universities do, and I like teaching. I like seeing students, you know, do the same exercise I've done, which is being challenged and inspired and kind of learn their basic steps in research. That's always, they have such a wider perspective than us, like a student who's just starting. They might not know what is a wide perspective and what's completely wrong, right? So that's where the supervisor comes. But they come up sometimes with questions that we stopped asking because we're so much into the field. So I find that refreshing. And yes, I think I'm enjoying whatever is crazy university juggling balls between teaching and research in an under-resourced world compared to what industry has. But I would argue we have so much freedom in academia that is a little bit envious for people who are in industry.
Absolutely. You mentioned you always look at interesting challenges. Can you share what interesting challenges are you looking at on non-pandemic days? What does a day in your life at the University of Bristol look like?
So we have cycles, right? So in term and out of term are very different.
Okay.
So when you are during the term, you have the teaching duties, and that means you have a lot of meetings, marking, you know, so that ends up being keeping the ball rolling on research, right? So you have your ideas and they are like going smoothly. Then we have these brilliant times, which are like the 1 month Easter break or the summer break, where you definitely have very, very few meetings, and there is no teaching, because in the UK, at least, we don't have a summer term. So that gives you this 3 month stretch where you, let's say, open the box of everything you've done and think and start planning what you want to do for the next year, right? What are the students' projects going? Do you want to change topic? What's interesting? What's out there? So you want to keep reading and knowing and keep things going during the term, and then you get the freedom in the summer, which is now. So now is usually the best time to start thinking, what problems have we addressed, what others have done, and what do you want to plan for next year? My typical day would be meetings with PhD students. So that's always throughout the year. So it's not term relevant, where we discuss what they've done, where are we going with the project. Then lots of meetings with other people for which there might be ideas in the future. They could be collaborators, they could be writing a grant. So like talking about, let's say, the big picture at where we want to go. And then the free time where I sit and just think about the problems, and I call it play student, where I can kind of go back to my student time and think about the problem as if I am the one who's going to solve it. I don't get usually to take it all the way to the end. So I have to give it to someone at some point. But I get these times where I'm just thinking about the problem or looking at literature review and planning what an idea can materialize into.
Okay. So you worked, you mentioned PhD students, but I believe you also taught undergrads, master students, and you also currently advise a lot of PhD students. Which projects do you enjoy? Do you think there's a distinct experience when you're working with different, I would say different levels of experience of students?
Different levels of experience. I wouldn't say there is a big difference. I think it's every person is different, whether they are a master student or a PhD student or even a postdoc. It's very much, they bring their individual strengths to the project. So I would say there is more variety within the students rather than across where they are in the stages. Of course, when you're talking to a third-year PhD student, your level of communication is different than a first year. I wouldn't tell a PhD student in the third year, show me the learning curve. But I would do it to the first year just to check that, that we know what we're talking about, right? So the level changes, but there is a lot about where they they want to introduce their ideas, while maybe my students won't agree with that statement a lot. I don't really give them completely free control in where the project goes, because the PhD is a short time, and I'm also keen on whatever they're doing being helpful to the whole group. But I always say that their first paper is my idea and their work. So the first paper is definitely very, very focused on where I know the state of the art is and where the opportunities are. And after that, it depends on the student. Some push back a lot and end up doing a lot of their ideas. And some take the idea that we started with and it becomes theirs, to the extent that I no longer think it was mine to start with. It had moved so much into their belief. Farnoosh, one of our students who just finished her PhD, was one of those. So we were doing action completion, which was initially my idea. I said, we can take a video of someone, I don't know, blowing a candle, but computer vision never checks that the candles get actually blown, right? So we kind of recognize this as a blowing action. We don't focus on the goal. And the idea as is started to be mine, but I think by the time she was the end of her second year, she was kind of starting to divide actions into what actions do have completion and what don't. And I felt she had more command of the idea than I was to start with. But it's very much on an individual student basis, and that depends on how much stress they have, helping them build their self-confidence about their ideas, their stuff, having to deal with failures because, the paper that they really like might get rejected, or they might have worked on something and missed the deadline because of something that might be out of their control. So I think there is a lot of dealing with that that's very much person specific. I do teach whatever we call undergrads. However, I currently only teach the final year. So to me, they're very much close to first year PhDs. Previously, I taught second year students. I've never taught first year undergrads. I think that's a lot of work. The 17 years old who've just left home and want to, I admire my colleagues who are very much focused on first year undergrad teaching. It's a lot of effort.
I'm sure I was one of the annoying students, if I remember correctly.
I think I was very much an annoying student. I wanted my questions answered immediately because I was thinking about them. I think that's the nature of the age. It's you're very excited about what you are learning.
So I also want to ask you, how do you pick your PhD candidates? You mentioned you look at everyone having a different personality. What students do you admire? How do you pick them?
Yeah, I always tell them hard work pays a lot more than being smart. So there is an element of being patient and hardworking, which is essential for a researcher. I would say if that's missing, I would not advise someone to be in research. And underline the fact that some people develop patience as they grow older, right? So it's not like I am impatient, so I'm not doing research, but you have to be willing to develop that level of patience, persistence, stubbornness, right? So that probably is number one. Then I would say the next stage is being able to join a group and work as a team. I think individualists in research might do great jobs, but they're very hard to supervise, very hard to build a group around. So sometimes you have to push people to kind of work together. It's not about my ideas or your ideas. It's that we have somehow a team to be able to push that wall that's called the state of the art or what's out there. It's a big wall, right? So you need force to push it. And then finally, they have to have that need to ask questions, right? So they have to be question askers. What about
Curious
this?
mindset.
What about that? Curiosity, right? And I think that's everything you need for a PhD student. It doesn't matter whether you are a brilliant programmer or you've done lots of internships before. What the supervisor is looking for in the interviews are these. And I usually give people a paper they haven't read, ask them to read it and come for a second interview. That's where I see their question answering. If they say, this paper is great, I'm like, okay, typically I wouldn't take these students. If they tell me, oh, the paper is good, but what about this? What about that? I think this is what typically I'm looking for.
How do you advise someone who's looking to break into the field? How should they inculcate this mindset, or how should they get their career across in the right manner? Because many people try to pattern match into, oh, this is what Dima would want. Now we know that. They'll just try to match that.
So certainly join a good group. There are so many computer vision groups around. And I'm noting the word good rather than great, because there's like this big competition to, let's say, the top 10. A good group is a group that has focus, so there is a topic. And I think that then depends on which supervisor you'd want to work with. I was lucky that I met my supervisor before I applied to work with him, but I know many people just are taking a dip in a pool that's completely new, right? So they don't know. There is a lot of effort to manage your supervisor, and there are good books. I read one of them. I gave one of my students a Manage Your Supervisor book because I thought he needed to kind of push back on me. So there are ways to manage and develop your confidence, but there isn't one way into being a good researcher. There are, like, I'm sure you've seen that already in your interviews. There isn't like a recipe to become a researcher in the field. There are so many ways. Absolutely. That you just need to take one and keep going. You'll get there.
Do you see a disadvantage compared to bigger institutes like you mentioned, the top 10? Many people look at it as a bigger disadvantage. They might have more resources. They have this, they're easier to gate. They're not as much gate kept compared to others.
I wouldn't know because I've never tried, let's say, being in, I don't know, let's say Oxford or Toronto, right? So these are like the groups that might have the spotlight on them all the time. I see it both an advantage and disadvantage, right? It might be concerning to go there and having to actually, then you produce a paper that might not be your best paper, and they would say, oh, would they not produce that best paper being in this X place? So maybe being in your own individual group, you need to develop your signature. Having been in Bristol now for 10 years, 7 years in which I started kind of building my group, I would say we got the attention in the past 2-3 years as a group doing something interesting. And once that happens, just do good work. If you do good work, you'll be noted wherever you are. As long as the group is good and has momentum, is moving, is producing, publishing, I don't think the size is such as big an advantage as people think. You might need to do more marketing and talking about your work than maybe others. But I am not sure how big that gap is anymore. I used to think it's that big. Now, I think it's not that big. I think good work gets picked up if you keep at it. It might take a little bit longer, a couple of years more to be noted, but in the scope of your career, I don't think it matters.
I'm an outsider to research, so please pardon my stupid question, but I believe what I've understood by going through your research is what excites you about different problems is not always the most resource intensive problem. And I think for the institutes with not access to the biggest resources, it's also an interesting dimension, because how do you come up with more practical ideas for lesser resources, which is what really the industry needs of sorts.
So unfortunately, video is more resource intensive than other areas. So you need to, if you want to do video, and there are lots of problems in video, you need to think about, let's say, the resource. And we put out one of the biggest data sets in video understanding. So we're into big data as such. So I can't say we don't have enough resources, but you think how to manage them, right? So you think how you can have a small test bed that you can maybe debug stuff in, how you can join a particular cluster in another university with some collaborators so you get more access. And as I tell all the students, there are like 1 million experiments you can run, but which ones do you actually need to prove this idea? So that I think is the hardest thing currently for researchers. They don't know. They don't plan. which experiments do they actually need to prove their idea, and they end up with this. Let's say they think they need too much resource. I think things take time. You have to be patient. If you're thinking, oh, in 3 months I'll develop a paper, I think that is fundamentally wrong. Like you need at least 3 months to swallow the idea, right? Yes, we can't in universities maybe develop new architectures, because that search for big architectures requires some extreme amount of resource, so we don't try that. But I am not interested in that either. But definitely we need resources. It's a big ask for researchers in institutions, wherever they are, small or big. And Bristol has an amazing cluster for all researchers that we can use called Blue Crystal. You do need resources, but also you have to think about how to use whatever you have, and be patient. Let something take 1.5 years. I don't understand this rush that unless a paper is done in, I don't know, a year, if I miss the deadline, the idea is gone. I've heard that often. I definitely don't go by that rule, neither do my students. Many of them start putting their papers out in year 3 of the PhD, and I haven't seen that as an obstacle in others identifying them as great researchers. Bit of patience and planning.
That's amazing advice. I would still argue compared to, I read a recent paper, I don't want to name the institute, people would already know that took the power equivalent of a nuclear reactors some minutes to train. So compared to that.
If that's what they enjoy, I don't want to criticize them. I don't find that, let's say, interesting for me. If that is something that excites them, perfect. I don't think the problems we're after, which is trying to understand the fine-grained nature of actions, requires that in any way. I would say there is a place for everyone, regardless of what they think is the problem they would like to solve before their career finishes. And if you find that problem, you won't be distracted by sources or by other papers being published, because you have a goal.
Again, the curious mindset will find its path.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very true.
How do you suggest someone with a minimal hardware, let's say one shiny GPU, produce good research? What should they focus on, or how should they
read lots of papers? If you don't know the state of the art, you will start developing quickly an idea that's already out there. That's the most frustrating aspect to a researcher who's been around for a while, right? A student who reads 10 papers and then say, I developed this new idea, which there is no way, right? Just the logic says that's impossible, right? Read a lot of papers. Work with people who might have seen more papers, so that they would tell you, read that paper in 1995, right? That is very important. The research didn't start in 2012. Computer vision did not start in 2012. Deep learning did, right? So, but not computer vision and not machine learning. So maybe work with others. It's a very collaborative type of area. So find others you would like to work with so they can highlight things. Find your idea, check it's novel, or could be novel. Even if you're not sure it's novel, maybe it will develop into something that's novel. Keep an eye then on what comes out there in that particular area. Maybe put all alerts you can think of so you can keep reading. And then look at your data. I think that's where the research eventually becomes really interesting. If you just chuck data in and get numbers out, I doubt there will be really novel research. If you open the box data or the model data, I like the data. I like actually to look at what is there in the input, right? Because usually that's underexplored. Rather than let's open the model and maybe change a regularizer, right? So there is space for both. I like looking at what is in the input that's underexplored. And then as we come back to the same thing, saying, and then keep at it, be patient, keep at it. And if you submit a paper, then it gets rejected. It's either because you have missed some ideas. And so the biggest effort is usually once you got feedback, what do you do now? How are you getting now? You figured out what they didn't understand or they didn't like. You work at it, and it might happen again. You might get a second rejection, but when it goes out, it will be novel and interesting research.
You've interacted with many students, I think, over this rich decade of your experience. What would you say is the number one mistake that students of any level are pursuing deep learning or computer vision make?
So we mentioned the learning curve, right? I find that extremely funny that it's always they haven't looked at the learning curve. Like they've learned it, they know it, right? But then they go so much into the practice that they don't look at what's happening during the optimization. But I think the number one mistake that people have, not carefully reading previous work, and what would be the number one mistake? Not carefully reading previous work, and then not understanding what your numbers mean. So I got 1% better. What does that mean? Did you actually fix a new bunch of data inputs that you never fixed it? Why? Why did that actually happen? Because that's where you end up actually developing something interesting. So yeah, the meaningful of input output tends to be usually where mistakes happen.
I think as a beginner, this is something I've also struggled with, which is I had this mental barrier. I am not able to read papers. And once I'm able to, I keep just reading papers. How much of a balance should be there? How much of hands-on versus understanding the field should happen?
It's you have to have both, right? Because you can't even understand papers if you haven't started having your hands with the data, right?
Yes.
You don't understand what the meaning of the papers are. It's just when you go into the data to keep the paper reading alive, to not really get so much into only your problem, to keep reading. Reading becomes easier with time because papers are very similar, right? So you've read, I don't know, 100 papers in, say, object detection. Usually in paper 101, there are 3 lines you actually need because you've read everything else, right? There's not what these people actually do. But if you don't invest early in reading the first 100 papers, you'll always find it hard. So yeah, read year 1 in research, whatever that is. It has to be 50% read, 50% work. That's year 1 for sure. And then keeping the reading alive, start reviewing, learn how to review. Yeah, that would be my advice. It's not about I read and understand. The first paper you read might take a week and you might understand 20% of it. But the time decreases and the amount of understanding increases within a field you're specializing in. I'm sure if I start now reading something completely off my topic, it will go back to 1 week of reading and 20% of understanding. Whereas when you specialize in an area, you really improve that understanding a lot and decrease the time significantly with more reading.
Which is why, again, going back to your advice, you need patience to be able to get through that.
A lot. And I am not a patient person by default in my life, except in research. In research, I'm like immensely patient. So I think you just develop that persistence.
For the audience, I'd like to point out, I think you were one of the best reviewers for CVPR.
Yeah, I got this trick from a colleague I worked with in Leeds. I was a PhD student. He was a member of staff, Mark Everingham, one of the best researchers we had, and we lost him a few years ago. He developed Pascal, which was one of the basic things that triggered, let's say, object detection. And he told me, you learn how to review first thing. And you would need someone to sit with you and teach you how to review. You appreciate how important reviewing is. So I to me, that's always important, to spend some time reviewing the paper, give it the attention, and provide the right feedback to researchers, because others are doing this for you. And even if you receive 3 bad reviews because they didn't put an effort, it doesn't matter. Your responsibility to the community is to do good reviews. And you get noticed. I keep being told that you get noticed because the ACs will remember who were the good reviewers. And that is kind of a hidden way for you to be known. You don't know that they had, because you don't know who the ACs are, but you will meet them at some point and they will remember that you were that reviewer. So putting an effort into the community pays off.
That's amazing advice. I want to take a step back. Many people who don't go to university. I went to university, but I mostly learned through online, open online courses. What MOOC suggestions would you have for students? Should
I
they do
have
MOOCs?
done,
How should they?
yeah, I remember when, just before the deep learning era came, there was the machine learning course by Andrew Ng. So that's what the first and the only MOOC course I've done.
The one that was recorded in Stanford, not from his lab
Yes,
room.
before Coursera. It was like the first thing. And I found that a very engaging experience, having known some of the basics. I really can't judge how useful these are if you don't know the basics. I don't know. Maybe I'm very old-fashioned. I would prefer a book. So for example, I read the deep learning book, which we used to teaching end-to-end. And that was when I thought I knew deep learning. Yeah, I don't know how detailed MOOC courses are, and thus I can't recommend, but I would say whatever resource you use, ensure it's not superficial. It's really deep and gives you time to pause and think. I'm always amazed by the fact that they expect you to learn something in 1 week. Like, what if I need 3 weeks to get this? So I probably don't understand the concept. To me, if you want to actually learn something, you need to be on your own with a book, and you need to have infinite time. So it might take you 1 day, 3 days, 10 days at your own pace and with your own thinking. But if you want to catch up with the topic, then maybe a MOOC course is interesting. If you want to learn something from scratch, being old-fashioned, I would say take a book.
Which book would you recommend, if any, or any few books?
There are very good books around that gives you the basics. It depends what your background is. I didn't come from the strongest mathematical background. I kind of, when I finished, I thought my maths was good, but I realized it wasn't that good. So I had to go back and read lots of linear algebra books, which looks crazy because they are textbooks for universities. If you don't know a topic, pick a textbook that is recommended in one of the best universities. They've usually thought about it.
That's amazing advice.
Yeah, exactly. So pick one of those textbooks and spend some time and read it. It will pay off amazingly, rather than get lots of information quickly. But maybe, as I said, I'm from the wrong generation here. I do believe in slow learning rather than fast bites. Maybe our brains are with like this, right? Because we lived before the internet.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%.
Maybe the new generation can do it differently. Well, my advice would be slow learning.
Just for reference, I agree with you on the slow learning part, not about the generation part. So I'd like to talk more about your research now. Coming back to action recognition and videos, which I believe is one of the main topics that you're interested in, that you focus on. What's the challenge here? If you could help us appreciate the problem better. People think of, at least from the broad media news, they look at computers and, oh, this is all, they're already better than humans at tasks.
Yeah, not in video. I wish we're really behind in video compared to what people can do with individual imaging. So we talked at the start at this framing problem, which is someone taking the world and then putting a frame around something that's of interest and for a goal. They've done a lot for you, and thus what you can do for object detection or scene understanding after the framing is done ends up, as you've seen in lots of success, being, let's say, possible, given a big data set, etc. When you don't have that problem, you have two concerns. One is the explosion in the amount of data, because then you have multiple frames, most of them very redundant. And people who are familiar with machine learning know that redundant information is not good. They want independence of features. Most of machine learning is about independence, right? And that's not present if you have a video, right? That's a huge redundancy. The other aspect is that there is so much irrelevant information in this mix. So that's even bigger than what you'll find in images. This combination ensures that we currently don't yet have the right architectures to just do what we hope for, which is I put an endless video in and I get a label or a caption out. We can't do that, right? So that's not possible. In my group, we've been focusing on something called fine-grained action understanding, right? So let's assume you are drinking from a glass. So we've looked at what happens. Did you actually drink all of the water in the glass? Is there still something left? All that information that is trivial for a human observer and completely impossible for a machine learning approach because it doesn't think about it. It tries to say you're drinking the glass from the glass, right? You're drinking water from the glass. What if you pick the glass up and you don't drink? What if there is a particular action for which you can identify a certain skill level? Are you doing this good enough, right? Are you better than someone else? Then what happens if you don't look at the time in this aspect of every frame? So we've looked at reversing time. What happens? And we have this nice paper last year that says that in object interaction, you can reverse time and it still is very reasonable. Because in outside object interaction, let's say if you look at the street, right? It will look very weird because you've broken so much concept. If you look at someone closing a bottle and opening a bottle, a human observer will think the inverse of close is a valid open. So the nature of, let's say, actions makes some of them reversible. Like you change a state of an object and you can change it back, but not if you break something, right? You can't change it back. All these seem obvious and trivial to a human, but I think the inability of current approaches to solve them highlight where the problem is. I think if we address these correctly, if a machine is able to say, oh, the plate is broken and will never be recovered, or this person is rolling the sushi roll better than someone else, if they can do those, what I call fine-grained, depends what you want to call it, right? If you can do those and deal then with the long-tailed nature of, oh, I might see something I've never seen before. I'm seeing someone rolling, I don't know, something that people might have in Africa, a particular meal. I don't know what it is, but I can see 2 videos and know who's doing it better, right? I have no clue what the dish is, but I have this understanding of how skilled someone is in performing an act. I know when they've changed their mind or when they hesitate. I know what labels they would give this, right? And they might give so many different labels. So it's not really one label. I think labeling is a big problem we currently have, as long as we expect either in training or in testing to evaluate using labels. Even if we do self-supervised, we're still having those labels to evaluate how good our self-supervision is. So I would say that's what we focus on, is the question of why is video analysis not understanding? And our take to it is because we can't solve these obvious aspects of it. If we start digging at them, we'll eventually solve what we want in video understanding.
I'll circle back to research shortly, but I also want to discuss an interesting tangent. You've contributed to datasets, which is also unique. You presented and shared one of the most unique datasets with an amazing trailer, and the dataset is now out on GitHub. People who have watched the trailer will know this too. Why making videos and sharing them in the kitchen is interesting. So the dataset is called Kitchen-100. Why is this an interesting challenge or dataset to create?
Yeah, so if you want to focus on people interacting with objects, then the most complex place of object interactions is the kitchen, right? That's where the complexity grows exponentially large. You have the combination of tools, and then you have objects that change state, and then you have mistakes, and you have skill level. So it kind of brings everything. You might find similar things, let's say, in a factory, where it would be very hard for us to collect, let's say, I don't know, people doing stuff in factories or carving wood, right? We wanted to collect enough data. And so all of us use lots of tools in the kitchen and achieve activities with varying level of complexity. So our focus on kitchen is as one of the most natural thing. Anyone will identify these as actions. Anyone can label them or understand them, but the machine can't. So where is this bottleneck? We really took a different route to dataset collection. Instead of coming up with a set of tasks or labels, say object detection or 1,000 word depths that we want to classify, we took what I call the autonomous driving approach, which is collect data and then figure out. So the autonomous driving, they put this camera on top of the car and let it drive. That's exactly the analogy we've done. We've given cameras that are wearable, so they're GoPros, ask people to put them on, switch them as soon as they walk into the kitchen and just capture everything, right? So that on itself was let's say, a change from data sets in action understanding. That gives you this continuous stream of what someone had done, but then the problem is what tasks and what labels, and that's what we started addressing slowly since 2018 when the first version of the dataset was out. What labels? We went down the route that again was inspired. So you can see that all of these are tricks that had been around in the community, but you bring them together. So in movies, people rely on subtitles, and movies have been around as a way to understand actions, at least actions like drinking coffee and sitting and standing, because movies don't have people actually cooking, right? So they're very superficial in what they capture out of life.
Yeah.
They cut all the boring or normal aspects of life and focus on the drama, which is fine. But they have these subtitles of what someone is doing, which they'd used successfully in computer vision for very quick labels. So we did the analogy by asking people to talk over their videos. And in this case, we said, oh, imagine a robot is going to replicate everything you've done in your kitchen. Could you tell us exactly what you've done? But you have to go to the level of opening the cupboard because you're talking to a robot. So that's the narration we've captured. The narration gave us lots of problems. You can retrieve a narration. You can group these narrations into classes. You can go and kind of identify what's going to happen in the future, so to do anticipation. You can find an action. So we have a bunch of tasks around one dataset, where that dataset was collected without a task in mind, but with the concept of all objects in the kitchen. So Epic-Kitchens was the name of the dataset, is the name of the dataset. We released the first version 2 years ago. And being what you call a smaller group, we wanted attention to the dataset being different, etc. And I have a sister who's in media, and she always tells me that, you really need to put a good advertisement for your thing. So we put so much work in this dataset that it was worth spending some time to create whatever is called a trailer. And yeah, that really made people think, oh, there is something out there. The video is nice. So let's say that's how they first get to know about it. There's a nice video. And then they start picking the data set. Then we went 2 years later, and 10 days ago, we released the extension. And that extension, again, was collected with the concept of what happens if you've collected data 2 years ago. And 2 years ago is not a long temporal span, right? You would think your data is still useful and still perfect, right? It's not 10 years ago. So we gave many of the same individuals cameras again. We asked them to do exactly the same, capture everything you've done in your kitchen. Some of them had moved houses. Some of them are still in the same house. You would assume that your labels are good enough and wide enough to still do this expansion into data capture 2 years later. And you would realize that that's not the case. There is a lot that had changed. The camera model had changed slightly. What they're doing in the kitchen had changed slightly. Some of them have gone healthier. Some of them have done less healthy. Right? But eventually, there is change. Life is in change. And that's a big call to data sets to kind of, I don't know what the right term is. They call it online learning, but it's lifelong learning. And our data sets need to question this freeze in time where we collect a data set and then think it will be applicable in the future. ImageNet is how many years ago? Now we kind of no longer like it as much. But the problem is lots has changed. Sensors have changed. Quality of cameras has changed. What people captured had changed. All the poses, facial expressions that people used to do when they would capture footage 10 years later, I would argue are completely useless for how the new generation is capturing, well, what their facial expressions are as they take on these new types of footage. So there is an element of catching up with life that computer vision is missing, and that's where we kind of introduced a little bit of unsupervised domain adaptation. Let's assume maybe the best thing to do is to collect more data and try to adapt to it as it changes. I'm sure the community will find lots of aspects in the data set that we haven't even thought of because of this, let's say, unconstrained nature of the collection.
Do you think this will also allow generalization beyond what the dataset was recorded for? Because I was looking at a few videos. I didn't download the dataset. It's pretty big for my little
Good,
machine,
yeah,
but
that's true.
I was looking at a few videos and I thought, that's somewhat similar, slightly different to how we cook food in India, let's say. So do you think there's another hop required in between, or is it possible to also generalize this to beyond?
So it's correct. I was in India this Christmas, just before we were all locked down. I got a very nice exposure into the amazing cuisine and the variability, right? Like, I don't think you have the word bread. Like, it kind of breaks down into an infinite amount of types.
Totally.
That I would say what we claim to have recognized bread will probably fail once you go to different cuisines. There isn't really this approach that the data you collect will be applicable or generalizable infinitely. But the worst problem is not even generalizable to the same kitchens we're capturing it at 2 years later ago. We really need data to be collected, and maybe not necessarily annotated, but lots of data to be collected so we understand the boundaries, let's say, of what we've recognized. We have people from different nationalities, but they were all cooking in what I call Western kitchens. So there is lots that's missing. We didn't have, intentionally for privacy reasons, we didn't have what I call collaborative cooking, right? So there's one person performing the task. There aren't multiple people. There is a lot in collaborative action understanding that is completely missing. It's baby steps. Video understanding is currently doing baby steps compared to, let's say, object recognition, which is if you already had framed an object, what it is. So the gap is very, very big, and the community appreciates that the gap is big, and that ends up in a very strong video understanding community, well linked, I would say. And we all know where the issues are, but I don't think anyone has like the magical answer as yet. I don't know whether it's incremental steps and we'll get there, or whether someone will come and introduce something that is very, very different. We all were very excited about RNNs, LSTMs, right? Time, that's how you model time. We could not make it work as good as feed-forward networks. So I think there is this element of frustration of how time should be captured. And it can only be solved by people who are focusing purely on video. If you're saying, how can I adjust faster RCNN to do video, you're not doing video. You're not going to solve video. So it's great. It's great to know that you're in one field in computer vision that definitely doesn't work. Let's see. I hope that soon that we wouldn't be the only field in computer vision that doesn't work. I think computer vision, as I said, is video. So you have to stop framing. And people are now capturing footage in this infinite stream, right? They just press that button and they live stream. They don't even record and check what they record. Like this is going crazy for people in the community to even absorb type of footage people share. But we need to start somewhere. I find object interaction more generalizable to different cultures than social. I think social definitely is very cultural, right? So I'm hoping that opening a bottle is the same all through the world. I don't have guarantees, but I'm assuming that there is more generality there, to be questioned, of course, by lots of people who want to discuss fairness and generalization. The dataset was not collected with that in mind. It was collected with how can we ensure we have long time, more than one sequence from each person, and even longer time 2 years later.
I could ask many interesting questions, but for the audience, I'd like to point them to a meetup that you had done, a presentation where actually pretty much all of the questions I could ask were answered in that. So please scroll down, find that. One interesting tangent I found, I think in one of your presentations, was there now all of these narrative-based videos as well on YouTube, which you said are unnecessarily slowed down sometimes. But do you think that can also unlock interesting tangents?
It's very interesting and similar to our data set Epic-Kitchens, which was based on a data collection. There is a big data set called How to 1 Million by our colleagues in RIA that is looking at collecting this footage from YouTube with narrations.
Okay.
Slight issue with narrations is people say stuff that doesn't show in the video. Imagine you're showing people how to cook a recipe. You tend to tell them stuff like, and now you bring this pre-cut stuff and you add it. Like the videos are edited in a way. It's not as bad as, let's say, a TV show where everything is pre-cut and perfect, but it's also not natural life. So it's somewhere in between, but it's a resource we can build a lot on. Like getting this effort that people do in uploading stuff online. And some of the work we've done with Skill was doing that. We just downloaded tens of videos of someone doing the same task, let's say origami, and you'd be amazed how varied their skill sets are, even though they have the courage to put it up and say that's how you do origami. They probably are not the best. So we've done a lot of work with skill understanding, looking at lots of footage that people upload online and giving them this varied variability.
So now coming back to research, one of the goals for my podcast is also learning how great people approach different problems. I'd love to understand your process by maybe discussing about your recent works, maybe on action modifiers. Can you tell us, maybe using that as an example, what does a research pipeline for you look like?
I can't take the credit of the word great researchers. I'll be good enough. But how do we approach action modifiers? So I just mentioned the work on skill. So this was like a build up on it. In CDPR last year, 2019, we did this work on skill understanding from footage online. Even though we could rank people by their skill, saying this person is better than that, there wasn't any feedback we could give that is meaningful. Like, why is this person doing it better? So looking at data sets like How to 1 Million, they have these tasks like cooking, and then the person says sentences like, and you need to cook this fine, to cut this finely, or you need to add sugar slowly. And Hazel, who's the student leading on the skill work, was always she was always asked, how can we feedback to people if they're not doing it good enough? So she was kind of feeling that my research is reaching a corner because I can't give feedback. We started thinking what type of feedback we can give to individuals. And adverbs, which are these descriptions that people give to describe how a particular act should take place, say slowly, finely, quickly, carefully, seem to be an underexplored thing in the whole idea between video and language. There's prior work in objects and attributes or adjectives. So red button, right? So adjectives and the corresponding thing in actions would be adverbs. So there was a lot of research we could build on, but we know it can't be directly applied because it's in this notion of, let's say, red or sporty, which you know how to describe visually. If I tell you red, there is a visual signature for red. But if I tell you quickly, you need to somehow ground it in an action to know what it is, right? Because quickly for stirring will be very different than quickly for drinking, right? The visual signature is very action relevant. So I would say that's where we started. We wanted to do something that explains skill. We thought adverbs is a good idea. And then we started looking at what is out there in terms of adverbs in the dataset that I just mentioned, How to 1 Million. There were a lot of problems we faced in terms of long tail. Not many adverbs get used. So we had to kind of say, okay, let's work with just 6 or 8 adverbs for which we have enough data to play with. So that was a little bit of, let's say, a knockdown. We can't just learn any adverb because there are not enough data to learn or to detect. Okay, so we said, okay, that's fine. We still be an introduction to what adverbs mean. And then we said, okay, we're just saying you can't describe the adverb on its own. It has to be tied to an action. So we said it might be defined then as a transformation of an action. So that was like the building block. Then, of course, there is a resource out there, but it's not properly labeled. So someone might say, and now you add sugar slowly. But when they say that word, that's not exactly when that video is showing the slow addition. It's nearby, but it's not exact.
It's not a one-on-one mapping always.
Yeah, so it's not exact. So we had to think about how you can learn in a weekly supervised manner when you're trying to learn two things, that transformation, but also which bit of the video to learn it from. I would say the research goes through cycles where you think, okay, I can't do this big problem. What bit can I cut off? Okay, what's interesting about my solution? What's problematic about my solution? Is that a limitation or is that an opportunity, right? This thing. And then the biggest, I would say, push is when you write it, because that's when you discover all the holes. Or you kind of figure out, yeah, what I've done is good, it really works. There is a story here. So writing is a lot of thinking about what you've done, what you could have done, and how can you describe what you've done in a good way. And action modifiers was one of those papers that was accepted first time. So I think that the credit to that is primarily for the time we spent in writing it clearly, because it was a new idea. What are adverbs? Like, oh, adverbs are the same as adjectives. No, let's step back. Like, read is different than quickly. So you need to take your readers, like hold their hands as you tell them the story of what they've done. So by the end, they know that you've contributed something new and that the method you've used is the right, or is one of the right answers for the problem you're posing. But it started with a bit of frustration when people are looking at our skill work and asking us, so how do you know what this person had done incorrectly? Sometimes being cornered or being frustrated often by lots of researchers asking you a question triggers great research. And I would say the dataset Epic-Kitchens was that. I did lots of work in object understanding. I presented it in a few universities, and the first question would be, what's the size of the dataset you're working with? I felt we didn't have a big enough dataset, that I came back thinking, no one is collecting this for me, I need to collect it. So take any criticism to your research. You can defend it, but if it keeps coming back, that's a question of how can you address it differently.
Just curious, how do you find these, to step back a bit, how do you find these interesting or fun ideas to explore these tangents?
I have more ideas than time or resources. I think it probably is the person, right? I'm very good at asking questions, that I always have lots of ideas that I need to park because there isn't time to think about them. And sometimes you park them and they go away, and sometimes they keep nagging. And then the next step is to find a student who believes in that question and takes it further, and they change it, right? But you felt at least you've tried to address it. I don't think I had that question of, oh, what's the next idea I want to work on? It's always like, out of all that mesh of possible things I like to explore, which ones can I explore given the time and resources without the student saying, I can't do more? Yeah, so it's mostly limited resources than limited ideas.
Okay. So usually I try to end the questions on a broad, the interviews on a broad question or a broad, wide advice. So I'd love to discuss one aspect that I learned by your recent tweet, which was you shared that it was a thread, so it's difficult to explain Twitter in a video format. You explained in that thread that you had 0 accepted papers in one of the conferences, one of the reputable conferences. You kept a positive attitude. How can researchers, sometimes they get frustrated by that, how can they follow that attitude?
That was a very funny tweet because Raquel, who's one of the best researchers in the field, the leader of Uber Vision and a professor at Toronto, put this tweet, which we all do, right? When you get big success, you kind of advertise it. So her tweet was 12 papers accepted at ECCV, and I now deserve a summer vacation. I was so bugged by the concept that because the papers were accepted, she felt she deserved a vacation, or the message gave that impression. And I thought, well, that's not the right message. Like, we had 2 papers in, they were rejected. I was so sad. So let's put that right? I didn't have a positive attitude about the rejection in any way, right? I was very sad and disappointed, and there were tears, right? So that's the truth. But I felt I definitely, and the students deserve the vacation. The fact that the papers get rejected is definitely not in any way an indication that you didn't work hard. And that message, I thought, is worth sharing. I always share failures and successes. Maybe I fail failures more than successes. To put it right, maybe I'm a pessimist rather than I would come and say that did not work, right? My friends would know that that did not work. I might forget to tell them that this worked, but they would definitely know that something did not work. And I talk about it. There is a culture of people not talking about failures, and it gets worse in academia. So we have in academia something called promotions. That's when you go up the ladder.
Mm-hmm.
People don't say that they applied for promotion until they get it, because what if it was turned back? It's like one of those hidden secrets in academia. And I find that very strange. Like, why? As in, I think you should share failures and successes. Positive attitude is all about, you really need to like your work. The more you like it, the more you'll be disappointed. That's a fact. The question is, what do you do after that? Do you say, oh, no one ever liked it? Or do you say, I can refine it and it will be better next time? You will be disappointed for sure. That you shouldn't hide it. I think you should just share it and say, it did not work. It was my best paper ever. And no one saw that coming, right? But after you do all the drama, what do you do after that? And what you need to do after that is to think, what should I do next so that it's clearer, better, more impactful, and keep at it. And then it will work. I have had so much papers get rejected and grants get rejected, and the success rate in anything is very low. It's a waste of time. I would hope that the process is different, so that we don't waste so much time, at least in grants, because they end up in the bin as opposed to papers. They get recycled and get better. So there is a lot of time waste. I would like to, as a member of this community, think about how we can make it better. So I don't accept the status quo as the best we could do for researchers at all their scales. I think we should think about things differently. Maybe we should rename the word paper rejection into paper deferral. That's a fact, right? It's not a rejection, right? It's just work on it again. Maybe we need to think about our terminology, and I admire all the colleagues that say maybe many people leave research because the attitude might suit some people more than others, and that's unfair. That's unfair. If you are very sensitive, you might think that's not the place for me. Because I get those rejections and I take them badly. I still take them badly, very badly. And I know many of my colleagues do, but I kind of learned to deal with them. I don't want other researchers to go through exactly the same process of learning how to deal with them. I think we need to do something differently. And the fact that tweet ended up having so many likes made me think, we definitely need to do things differently. We definitely need to question, I don't know what it is, the terminology, the attitude, the how we celebrate success, but also how we celebrate beyond small successes. How we look at, a year's long worth of work, right? Rather than a paper or a grant, or maybe 5 years worth of work, and kind of look at the big picture. And the notion of numbers concerns me. I don't believe there are 1,000 new ideas in computer vision that get developed every CVPR, and then this year plus 1,300 new ideas in ECCV. That's not reasonable, even if the community is 10,000, and it's not. We have 10,000 attendants in CVPR. They're mostly in industry, right? We don't have 10,000 researchers doing computer vision. So there is no way we have at least 2,000 new ideas every year. We're really over publishing, over being pushed into how many papers did you publish each year. How could you have more than 2-3 ideas each year? Like, yeah, you can collaborate, and that ends up increasing the number of ideas. But we definitely, guilty as charged, all of us, we definitely are over publishing. And over advertising success. And we all know research is about failure. is about doing something that has not been done before, and by default, get lots of knockbacks. So we need to look at that knockback differently, advertise it differently, talk about it differently, and even if it hurts, think about what happens after that differently. And I'm very lucky to have lots of family and friends who kind of understand the nature of what this job is and how failures and successes get evaluated, how harsh the concept of peer reviewing can be. Peer reviewing is about people who are trying to answer the same question as you, who are the people who will judge your question. And they try to be as objective as possible, but they're human. So there always will be this nagging feeling of, I thought about that idea and it never worked, so it must be not working for them either, right? And I'm not saying reviewers are not doing their utmost best to be objective. I'm just saying we have to acknowledge that there is a subjective aspect to it. We as a community are trying to filter ideas. And as we do that, it is the community's success or the community's failure. And as long as we're all publishing, we're all successful because we're doing it as a community, not as individuals. We start looking at it like this, I think our individual attitude and the terminology will dramatically change.
Those are amazing words and amazing advice to end the interview on. I would certainly say you have set this example for the community, for all of us. Thank you for doing that. Before we end the call, what would be the best platforms to connect with you for anyone from the audience that'd like to?
I'm going to say I reply to emails regularly, but I don't want to do that and then end up failing anyone. But if there is something that you would want to learn about our research, then the student who's usually the first, or the postdoc who's usually the first author in that paper is the best person to email. Do copy me in, but they would know more details than I would do. If you want to know about the dataset, we have a specific email address that's very well monitored to answer all questions on the dataset. I'm on Twitter. That's my only social media outlet interaction. That's where I tell people about our latest research, and I also see what's out there. I think there is a good computer vision community on Twitter. But if you believe there is a question you want me to think about, definitely drop me an email, and my email is easy to find on my webpage.
I just looked around. I have your Twitter handle open in the video for anyone who watches the video. Please follow Dima at Dima Damen, her first name and her second name. That's her Twitter handle. Dima, thank you so much. Thank you
very much for the opportunity to just think beyond, let's say, the big picture and maybe one paper, etc. I hope that the viewers would find the ideas within research interesting, and maybe the scope outside research interesting. And if you disagree with any of these things, remember that there is a place for everyone and every idea and every attitude. And that's where we want to be, hopefully. But special thanks for the opportunity. It's been fun.
Thanks to you. Thanks for making this happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to give it a review, or feel free to shoot me a message. You can find all of the social media links in the description. If you like the show, please subscribe and tune in each week to Chai Time Data Science.